penthouse was perfectly quiet, save for the soft hum of the city below and the rhythmic tapping of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Wyatt watched Reagan from the shadows of the hallway as she poured herself a glass of Merlot, her elegant silhouette a picture of domestic grace, until his eyes dropped to the glowing screen of her unlocked phone on the marble counter. A six-figure deposit notification from an offshore account, followed instantly by a late-night text from a man who was not him. The flawless life they had built over a decade was unraveling in the pristine silence, piece by deceptive piece. If the quiet tension of falling marriages and the dangerous allure of buried truths captivate you, stay with me as we watch a kingdom of lies meticulously burn. The rain over Chicago didn't fall. It drifted, painting the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse in long, weeping streaks of amber streetlights. Wyatt James sat in the leather chair of his home office, the only illumination coming from the harsh, cold glow of an iPad resting on the mahogany desk. It wasn't his. It was Reagan's old tablet, the one she claimed was dead and shoved into the bottom drawer months ago. He had only plugged it in to salvage some old architecture references they had saved in a shared cloud. He stared at the screen. The muscles in his jaw tightened so fiercely that a dull ache bloomed behind his ears. On the screen was an email application he didn't recognize, tied to a server he had never seen, auto-synced by a fateful glitch in Apple's latest firmware update. The top email was a monthly statement from a financial institution in the Cayman Islands. The account balance listed was just shy of $2.4 million. The account holder was RS Consulting LLC. Reagan Scott. Wyatt's breathing was shallow, incredibly quiet. The numbers blurred, replaced by the memory of Reagan sitting across the kitchen island just last week, her brow furrowed in artificial concern as she told him they needed to hold off on renovating the lake house. "The Foster Foundation is restricting my bonuses this quarter, honey. We need to be careful with our joint savings," she had said, her hand reaching across the marble to squeeze his. He scrolled down, his finger trembling slightly. Below the bank statement was a notification from a hidden messaging app. A preview banner hung suspended in the digital space. "Richard Davis. The board approved the new vendor contracts. Your cut is secured. See you at the hotel Thursday. Wear the red dress. Miss your taste already. Richard." The senior board member of the Foster Foundation. The man who had toasted to Wyatt and Reagan's 10-year anniversary with a glass of vintage champagne, clapping Wyatt on the shoulder and calling him a lucky man. Wyatt didn't throw the tablet. He didn't scream. The grief didn't arrive with fire. It arrived as ice, freezing the blood in his veins, paralyzing his lungs. A heavy, suffocating silence pressed against his eardrums. 10 years of marriage. 10 years of compromising, of building, of believing in the sanctuary of their shared life. All of it had been a carefully constructed stage play, and he was the only one who didn't know he was the fool. The soft hum of the private elevator engaging broke the silence. Reagan was home. Wyatt's heart slammed against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He heard the familiar click of her heels against the hardwood of the foyer, the soft rustle of her trench coat being draped over the chair. "Wyatt, you in there?" Her voice floated down the hallway. It was melodic, tired, utterly normal. The voice of a woman who loved him. Wyatt stared at the digital proof of his own murder. The betrayal of her body with Richard was a blade to the chest. The methodical, calculated theft of their future, dollar by dollar, was a slow poison. She wasn't just leaving him, she was planning to leave him with absolutely nothing. He gently pressed the power button on the iPad. The screen went black, plunging the office back into the shadows. He took a slow, deep breath, burying the shattered pieces of his soul deep in his chest. When he stood up and walked toward the hallway, his face was a mask of perfect, untroubled devotion. "Hey, sweetheart," Wyatt said softly, stepping into the ambient light of the living room. "How was the foundation?" The neon sign of the Silver Spoon Diner buzzed with a low, erratic hum, casting a sickly red glow across the wet asphalt of the parking lot. It was 2 in the morning. Inside, the air smelled faintly of stale grease, lemon bleach, and burnt coffee. Wyatt sat in the furthest corner booth, his hands wrapped around a thick porcelain mug. The coffee inside had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but he hadn't taken a single sip. The bell above the glass door chimed. Mike Johnson stepped out of the relentless Chicago drizzle, shaking his umbrella before scanning the half-empty restaurant. When his eyes found Wyatt, the casual, sleepy smile on his face faltered. He navigated the narrow aisle, sliding into the cracked vinyl seat across from his oldest friend. "You sounded like someone died on the phone," Mike said, his voice low, stripping away their usual banter. "You said you needed a structural consult at 2 a.m. Wyatt didn't say a word. He reached into his leather messenger bag, pulled out a thick, unmarked manila folder, and pushed it across the sticky laminate table. Mike frowned, wiping a stray drop of rain from his brow before opening the cover. For a long moment, the only sound between them was the distant clatter of silverware from the kitchen and the steady drumming of rain against the window. Mike, a man who had spent the last 15 years as a forensic accountant, untangling corporate fraud and messy divorces, knew exactly what he was looking at. His eyes darted across the printed pages, offshore routing numbers, wire transfers, LLC registrations in the Cayman Islands. "RS Consulting," Mike muttered, his index finger tracing the receiver line. He looked up, his expression hardening. "Wyatt, this is Reagan's maiden name." "And the sender?" "The Foster Foundation," Wyatt said. His voice was hollow, perfectly flat, suppressing the rage he felt clawing at the back of his throat. Or, more specifically, dummy vendor accounts approved by the Foundation's board. Mike exhaled slowly, leaning back against the booth. "This isn't a rounding error, Wyatt. This is systematic embezzlement. There's over $2.4 million here. How did you get this?" "An iPad glitch," Wyatt replied, staring blankly at the dark surface of his coffee. A firmware update synced an encrypted mail server she thought was disconnected. "I found the bank statements, and I found the messages." Mike's gaze sharpened, the protective instinct of an old friend flaring up. "Messages?" Wyatt closed his eyes. The memory of the text preview burned behind his eyelids, a brand on his consciousness. Richard Davis, the senior board member. "She's sleeping with him, Mike. They're siphoning Foundation money, washing it through these shell companies, and—" He paused, swallowing the sharp, metallic taste of betrayal. "And she's draining our joint brokerage accounts into it. Slowly. 10,000 here, 15 there. She disguised them as capital investments for her career development. I signed off on half of them without looking." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the table. Mike looked back down at the papers, the analytical side of his brain taking over as a necessary defense mechanism against his friend's agony. "She's building a war chest," Mike said quietly, tracing the dates of the transfers. "If she files for divorce right now, she'll claim the marital assets are depleted from market losses or bad investments. She'll walk away with half of whatever is left of your architecture firm, and she'll keep the offshore money entirely untouched. She's going to bleed you dry, Wyatt." Wyatt looked out the window at the empty, rain-slicked street. He thought of the dinner they had shared earlier that evening. Reagan had kissed his cheek, complained about the stress of the nonprofit, and asked him to pour her a glass of Merlot. She had looked at him with the exact same warm, affectionate eyes she had used for a decade. It terrified him. He was sharing a penthouse with a ghost, a woman who didn't exist. "If you confront her now," Mike warned, his tone shifting into strict professional territory, "she'll panic. She'll move the money deeper, delete the digital trail, and Richard Davis has enough legal firepower to bury you in court for years." "I'm not going to confront her," Wyatt said. He turned his gaze back to Mike, his eyes devoid of their usual warmth, replaced by a cold, architectural calculation. "I built the foundation of our life, Mike. I know how to dismantle it, but I need to know where the structural weaknesses are in these accounts. I need you to help me break in." Mike stared at him for a long time, the red neon light washing over the table, illuminating the absolute resolve in Wyatt's face. Finally, Mike closed the manila folder and pulled it toward his side of the table. "I'll need every tax return from the last 5 years," Mike said softly. "Let's tear it down." The scent of bergamot and expensive cedarwood filled the humid air of the master bathroom. Wyatt stood leaning against the marble doorframe, a crystal glass of bourbon warming in his hand. He watched the reflection of his wife in the sprawling vanity mirror. Reagan was carefully applying a thin layer of crimson lipstick, her movements practiced, elegant, and entirely composed. It had been 4 days since the diner. 4 days of living inside a ghost story. Every afternoon, while Wyatt sat in his architecture firm reviewing blueprints, Mike sent encrypted files to a secure server. The labyrinth Mike had uncovered was staggering. RS Consulting was only the beginning. There was Crescent Holdings, registered in Delaware, and Blue Harbor Ventures, quietly operating out of the British Virgin Islands. Over the past 18 months, Reagan had meticulously routed a small fortune of joint marital assets, bonuses, stock dividends, and savings Wyatt had trusted her to manage, into these shells. She layered the thefts beneath legitimate-looking capital investments and foundation vendor payouts, a financial architecture far more complex than any skyscraper Wyatt had ever designed. "Can you help me with this?" Reagan asked, pulling Wyatt from the numbers swirling in his head. She turned her back to him, sweeping her dark hair over one shoulder to expose the long, delicate zipper of her black evening gown. Wyatt stared at the pale expanse of her skin. A week ago, this simple domestic request would have sparked a quiet rush of affection. Now, staring at the nape of her neck, all he could see was Richard Davis's text message burning in the digital dark. "Miss your taste already." Wyatt set his bourbon on the counter. He stepped forward, his leather shoes silent against the tile. His fingers brushed her skin as he grasped the cold metal tab of the zipper. It took every ounce of his willpower, every fragment of his sanity, not to let his hands tremble. He pulled the zipper up slowly, smoothing the fabric over her shoulders. "Thank you, sweetheart," Reagan murmured, turning around to adjust his collar. She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners in a perfect imitation of warmth. "I hate these late-board dinners. I'd much rather be on the couch with you watching a movie." Wyatt looked directly into her eyes. They were the same hazel eyes he had woken up next to for 3,600 days. "I know," Wyatt said, his voice a masterclass in gentle sympathy. "But the Foster Foundation needs you. Richard leans on you too much, though. You should tell him to delegate." Reagan sighed, a beautifully rehearsed sound of exhaustion. She picked up her diamond earrings, fastening them with quick precision. "Richard is just particular. He doesn't trust anyone else with the vendor contracts. It's exhausting, but the year-end bonuses will be worth the overtime. I promise we'll look at the lake house renovations once this quarter closes." The lie was so seamless, so breathtakingly casual, it felt like a physical blow to Wyatt's ribs. She was using the very money she was stealing to build the alibi for why it was gone. "Don't burn yourself out," Wyatt replied softly, leaning in to press a kiss to her temple. He breathed in the bergamot, committing the scent of her deceit to memory. "Take your time tonight. I'll be here." "I love you," she said, grabbing her clutch and brushing a stray piece of lint from his lapel. "I love you too," he answered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Wyatt stood in the quiet of the bathroom, listening to the sharp click of her heels retreating down the hardwood hallway, followed by the heavy thud of the front door closing. The penthouse plunged into a deafening silence. He picked up his bourbon, the ice completely melted, and walked slowly toward his home office. The husband she thought she had left behind was dead. What remained was an architect, and he had a demolition to plan. The drafting room of James & Associates was a sanctuary of precision. Long oak tables held pristine sheets of vellum, and the air always smelled faintly of graphite and expensive plotter ink. At 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, the space was a cavern of shadows, illuminated only by the harsh, bluish glare of Wyatt's dual monitors. He was staring at the structural load calculations for a new commercial high-rise, but the numbers were meaningless. His mind was a loop of Reagan's perfectly rehearsed smile, the scent of her bergamot perfume, and the sickeningly sweet tone she used when she lied to his face. The glass door to the office clicked open. Mike walked in, his trench coat damp from the perpetual Chicago drizzle. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply pulled a flash drive from his pocket, plugged it into Wyatt's tower, and pulled up a chair. "I found the stress fracture," Mike said, his voice carrying the quiet intensity of a bomb technician. Wyatt finally looked away from his blueprints. "Show me." Mike opened a PDF. It was a dense, 70-page corporate charter for Crescent Holdings, the Delaware shell company Reagan was using as the primary funnel before routing the money offshore. "Reagan is smart," Mike began, highlighting a paragraph on the third page. "She layered the ownership structure through proxy directors to keep her name off the public registry. But she made one critical, arrogant mistake: to fund the initial capitalization of this LLC without raising red flags at the bank. She used the routing number from the joint revocable trust you two set up 5 years ago. Wyatt frowned, leaning closer to the screen. The trust we built for the estate planning? Exactly, Mike nodded, his finger tapping the glass monitor. Because she tied the origin of the LLC's primary funding to a joint marital trust in a community property state. The structural firewall of the corporation is compromised. Under Delaware's specific provisions for marital asset commingling, combined with a boilerplate clause her lawyer clearly copy-pasted into the bylaws, Mike took a deep breath. You are technically and legally considered a shadow managing member of Crescent Holdings. The silence in the drafting room was absolute. Only the faint hum of the computer tower dared to break it. What does that mean, Mike? Wyatt asked, though the cold, heavy dread settling in his stomach told him he already knew. It means you don't have to hack anything, Mike said softly. It means, as a legal co-owner of the Origin Trust, you have the fiduciary authority to authorize wire transfers out of Crescent Holdings. You can legally drain the account before she moves it to the Caymans. We can take it all back. Wyatt stared at the glowing text. A sudden, violent tremor ran through his hands. He clasped them together, resting them on the edge of the oak desk. He was an architect. His entire life was defined by creating stability, by building shelters, by ensuring things didn't collapse. What Mike was proposing wasn't just recovering stolen funds. It was an act of absolute demolition. To do this, Wyatt had to become the very thing he despised. He had to become a thief in the night, a liar playing a role, smiling over morning coffee while secretly gutting his wife's future. He looked at a silver-framed photograph on the corner of his desk. It was from their honeymoon in Santorini. Reagan was laughing, the Aegean wind in her dark hair, her eyes full of a love he had believed was the truest thing in the world. Then he thought of Richard Davis's text message. He thought of the $2.4 million of his sweat and blood, quietly packed into digital suitcases, waiting to fund her new life with another man. The tremor in Wyatt's hands stopped. The grief that had been drowning him for the past week crystallized into something hard, cold, and razor-sharp. How long do we have before she notices the transfers? Wyatt asked, his voice steady, devoid of any remaining warmth. Mike let out a slow exhale, recognizing the shift in his friend. The husband was gone. If we execute the wires through a series of blinded domestic trusts, 48 hours. Maybe 72 if she doesn't check the portal over the weekend. Wyatt reached out and turned the silver-framed photograph face down on the oak desk. The soft thud echoed in the empty office. Set up the trusts, Wyatt commanded, his eyes locked on the screen. We start tomorrow. The Chicago skyline outside the penthouse windows was a sprawling grid of amber and silver, indifferent to the quiet destruction taking place on the 42nd floor. The living room was perfectly still, save for the soft, ambient jazz playing from the ceiling speakers and the rhythmic tapping of Wyatt's fingers against the keyboard of his MacBook. He sat at the long marble dining table, a glass of sparkling water sweating onto a coaster beside him. 10 feet away, Reagan was curled up on the plush velvet sofa, a cashmere throw draped over her legs. She was holding her phone, her thumb swiping lazily across the screen. A small, private smile played on her lips. Wyatt knew that smile. He had spent a decade believing it belonged to him. Now, he knew it belonged to a hidden messaging app and a man named Richard Davis. Wyatt pulled his eyes away from his wife and looked back at the glowing screen. The interface of the secured banking portal was stark, clinical, and unforgiving. Mike had spent the last 48 hours building the landing zones, 3 blinded domestic trusts, heavily encrypted and legally registered under Wyatt's sole name as the primary beneficiary. Because of the critical structural flaw in Crescent Holdings, Wyatt's authorization credentials from their joint marital trust had been accepted by the system without triggering a single fraud alert. He navigated to the transfer menu. The total balance across the shell companies sat at $2,412,000. Wyatt's hand hovered over the trackpad. The sheer weight of the moment threatened to crush his lungs. He was about to erase her entire safety net, the very war chest she had built, by bleeding their marriage dry. A soft chime echoed from the sofa. "Everything okay?" Wyatt asked, his voice steady, casual. Not a single tremor betraying the adrenaline flooding his veins. Reagan looked up, her eyes wide and innocent. "Oh yes, just an email from the foundation. Richard wants to finalize the catering for the gala next week. He's such a perfectionist. You both work too hard, Wyatt replied smoothly. Make sure you charge them for the overtime. Reagan offered a soft, dismissive laugh and looked back down at her phone. The hypocrisy was a physical weight in the room, thick and suffocating. She was sitting in the home he paid for, using the phone on his family plan, texting the man she was sleeping with, about an event funded by the money she had stolen from him. Wyatt turned his attention back to the screen. The hesitation evaporated, replaced by a cold, architectural precision. He began the execution. He typed in the first wire amount, 800,000. Destination, Trust Alpha. He clicked Authorize. A small loading wheel spun for 3 agonizing seconds before a green checkmark appeared. Transfer pending. Clearing in 24 hours. He moved to the second account, 900,000. Destination, Trust Beta. The click of his mouse was the only sound in the room, perfectly masked by the brush of a snare drum in the jazz track playing above them. Authorize. Green checkmark. He moved to the final offshore reserve, the remainder of the funds. Destination, Trust Gamma. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped animal. If her phone pinged with a security alert right now, it would all be over. She would look up, see his screen, and the illusion would shatter before the money could settle. He waited. He watched her. She simply tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear and continued typing her message. Wyatt clicked Authorize. The screen flashed. The total balance of RS Consulting and Crescent Holdings dropped to 0.00. It was done. The phantom transfers were initiated. In 24 hours, the money would vanish into a legal fortress Reagan could never breach. Wyatt slowly closed the laptop, the soft click of the aluminum lid echoing in the quiet room. He had survived the crossing. He was no longer a victim. He was the architect of her ruin. The late afternoon light in Chicago slanted through the frosted skylight of the master closet, casting long, pale shadows across the meticulously organized rows of clothing. Wyatt stood perfectly still in the center of the room. The air smelled of cedar wood, expensive dry cleaning, and the faint, lingering note of Reagan's bergamot perfume. It was a space designed for 2 people sharing a seamless, affluent life, but today it felt like a beautifully appointed mausoleum. At his feet rested a single, dark leather duffel bag, the weathered one he used to take on architectural site visits before he made partner. With slow, deliberate movements, Wyatt began to pack. He did not take the Rolex Reagan had bought him for their 5th anniversary, nor did he pack the custom cashmere sweaters or the Italian leather loafers that represented the elevated status she had curated for him. Those things belonged to a man who no longer existed. Instead, he packed with surgical precision 3 plain changes of clothes, his passport, the silver pocket watch his late father had left him, and his toiletry bag. At the very bottom of the duffel, beneath his heavy wool peacoat, lay a thick manila envelope. It contained the final, notarized divorce petition, along with the zero-balance confirmation receipts from Crescent Holdings and the offshore accounts. The phantom transfers had cleared that morning. The money was gone, locked safely, within untraceable domestic trusts. Wyatt zipped the duffel bag closed. The harsh, metallic rasp of the zipper seemed deafening in the quiet room, but the sound was quickly swallowed by the ambient hum of the central air conditioning. He looked up at his side of the closet. He had taken so little that the missing items barely registered. It was a terrifying realization that a decade of shared history, of waking up in the same bed, of whispered promises in the dark, could be physically erased without leaving a visible dent. From the adjoining master bathroom, the sound of running water echoed against the marble tiles. Reagan was drawing a bath, preparing for the Foster Foundation's annual charity gala. It was the absolute pinnacle of her social and professional calendar, a night where she would stand shoulder to shoulder with Chicago's philanthropic elite. Wyatt picked up the heavy bag and walked silently down the hallway. He rode the private elevator down to the underground parking garage, the descent feeling like a slow plunge into deep water. He opened the trunk of his Audi, placed the duffel inside, and closed it with a soft click. His escape vehicle was loaded. When he returned to the penthouse, the bathroom door was ajar. Steam curled into the bedroom. Wyatt walked to his dresser and began to dress in his tailored tuxedo. He fastened the onyx studs of his crisp white shirt, his fingers steady, treating the garments like armor for a battle he was already guaranteed to win. "Is the car coming at 7? Reagan's voice drifted from the vanity. She stepped into the bedroom doorway, wrapped in a white silk robe. Her dark hair was pinned up in an elegant twist, and her makeup was flawless. She looked breathtaking. She looked like a stranger. Wyatt adjusted his bow tie in the mirror, meeting her gaze in the reflection. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, a final, fading pulse of the love that had defined his adult life. He let it die. 7 sharp, Wyatt replied, his voice a smooth, untroubled baritone. He turned to face her, offering a practiced, admiring smile. You look incredibly beautiful tonight, Reagan. You're going to be the center of attention. Reagan smiled softly, a genuine look of vanity and pride lighting up her hazel eyes. Thank you, sweetheart. Let's go make an impression. Wyatt nodded, his hands slipping into the pockets of his trousers where the cold metal of his car keys rested. The rehearsal was over. The stage was set. The ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a sea of crystal chandeliers, flowing silk, and the quiet, rhythmic murmur of old money. A string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner, their notes floating above the sharp clinking of champagne flutes. Wyatt stood in the shadows near a towering ice sculpture, a glass of sparkling water in his hand, watching his wife hold court. Reagan was radiant in a sweeping black evening gown, her laugh a practiced, melodic chime that captivated the circle of wealthy donors surrounding her. Beside her stood Richard Davis. His hand rested casually on the small of her back, a gesture disguised to the room as professional familiarity, but laced with a possessive intimacy that made Wyatt's jaw tighten. Only a week ago, witnessing that touch would have broken him. Tonight, it simply confirmed the necessary death of his mercy. They look like quite the team, a low voice murmured. It was Mike, standing shoulder to shoulder with Wyatt in the periphery of the gala. They do, Wyatt replied softly, his eyes never leaving Reagan. Enjoy the champagne, Mike. The structural work is done. It's time for the demolition. Wyatt moved through the crowd, his steps measured and perfectly calm. He approached the circle just as Richard leaned in to whisper something in Reagan's ear, drawing a breathless, admiring smile from her. Excuse me, Richard, Wyatt said smoothly, placing his hand gently on his wife's bare arm. Do you mind if I steal Reagan for a moment? A quick anniversary surprise. Richard smiled, a patronizing curve of his lips that spoke volumes. Of course, Wyatt. Don't keep our star away too long. We have the silent auction to announce. Wyatt guided Reagan away from the blinding lights of the main floor, leading her down a quiet, heavily carpeted corridor, lined with velvet curtains. They stepped into an empty alcove, insulated from the noise of the gala, the ambient music reducing to a dull throb. Wyatt, what is it? Reagan asked, smoothing the front of her dress, her eyes darting anxiously back toward the bright archway of the ballroom. I really need to be out there. Richard is waiting for me. I know, Wyatt said. His voice was no longer the warm, supportive tone of a devoted husband. It was cold, precise, and entirely hollow. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tuxedo and withdrew a thick, folded manila envelope. I wanted to give you this before the auction, Wyatt said softly, handing it to her. Think of it as my final contribution to your foundation. Reagan frowned, taking the envelope. A contribution? She opened the flap and pulled out the crisp white papers. Wyatt watched her eyes scan the top page. It was the heavily stamped, notarized petition for dissolution of marriage. Reagan let out a sharp, breathless laugh, her hand trembling. Wyatt, what is this? Is this some kind of sick joke? Keep reading, Reagan. She flipped the page. The second document was a bank statement. RS Consulting LLC. The balance was 0. She flipped frantically to the third page. Crescent Holdings. 0. Attached were the routing slips for the wire transfers, legally authorized by the shadow managing member, Wyatt James, into blinded, irrevocable domestic trusts. The transformation was instantaneous. The radiant, confident executive vanished into thin air. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her skin a sickening shade of gray. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The heavy diamond earrings suddenly looked grotesque against her pale neck as the papers shook violently in her hands. $2.4 million, Wyatt whispered. He took a single step closer, invading her space until she was forced to look up into his dead, uncompromising eyes. Did you really think you could use my own estate trust to fund your exit strategy with Richard? You built a glass house, Reagan. And you handed me the hammer. "Wyatt, please." Her voice was a broken rasp. The mask of a decade had melted away. Utter, naked terror had taken its place. "You don't understand. I can explain everything." "There is nothing left to explain," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "The penthouse is listed. My bags are in the car. The money you stole from our marriage is legally secured, and the money you stole from the foundation is Richard's problem." Wyatt stepped back, adjusting his cuffs with terrifying elegance. He looked at the woman he had loved for 10 years, feeling absolutely nothing. "Go back to your gala, Reagan," Wyatt said, turning toward the exit. "Go tell Richard you're bankrupt." The heavy brass doors of the Drake Hotel closed behind Wyatt, cutting off the faint strains of Vivaldi and the panicked, rising hum of the gala inside. The sudden absence of noise was deafening. He stepped out from beneath the grand awning into the cool, damp embrace of the Chicago night. The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and reflective, mirroring the harsh crimson and gold lights of the city's towering skyscrapers. The valet brought his Audi around, the engine purring softly in the damp air. Wyatt handed the young man a $20 bill, offering a brief, polite nod before slipping into the driver's seat. He closed the heavy door, sealing himself inside the leather-scented cocoon of his car. In the trunk lay his single duffel bag. In the rearview mirror, he saw the towering facade of the hotel, a glittering monument to the elite, now serving as the tombstone of his 10-year marriage. He put the car in drive and pulled out onto Michigan Avenue. The streetlights flickered rhythmically across the windshield as he drove, casting alternating bands of light and shadow over his face. The adrenaline that had propelled him through the last week, the late nights with Mike, the heart-stopping tension of the digital transfers, the icy execution in the velvet alcove, was beginning to evaporate. In its wake, a profound, crushing exhaustion settled deep into his bones. Wyatt had expected a rush of triumph. He had expected to feel vindicated, powerful, whole. Instead, as he navigated the desolate, late-night traffic, all he felt was an echoing, hollow silence. He thought of Reagan's face in the alcove, stripped of its arrogance, reduced to raw, unadulterated terror when she realized the scope of her ruin. He had taken back every cent that belonged to him. He had left her utterly exposed to Richard Davis, a man who valued utility and discretion above all else, and who would undoubtedly abandon her the moment the foundation's funds came under scrutiny. Wyatt had engineered a flawless demolition. Yet, as he glanced at the empty passenger seat, the victory tasted like ash. The $2.4 million safely locked in his trusts could buy him a new firm, a new house, a new life. But it could not buy back the decade he had spent believing in a ghost. It could not restore the innocence of a man who once looked at his wife and saw his entire future. To survive Reagan's betrayal, Wyatt had been forced to match her calculated ruthlessness. He had become a stranger to himself, a man capable of looking into the eyes of the woman he loved, kissing her temple, and smiling while methodically orchestrating her destruction. He stopped at a red light. The rhythmic click of the turn signal was the only sound in the cabin. Wyatt rested his forehead against the cool leather of the steering wheel. For the first time since he saw the fateful iPad notification, he allowed the grief to finally wash over him. It wasn't loud. There were no tears. It was just a heavy, silent mourning for the architect, who used to build things meant to last. The light turned green. Wyatt lifted his head. He looked out through the windshield at the sprawling, endless grid of the city. The rain clouds were finally beginning to break, revealing the faint, cold light of a crescent moon over Lake Michigan. He tightened his grip on the wheel, pressing his foot down on the accelerator. The engine roared, a solitary sound cutting through the midnight air. He was leaving the ruins behind, driving into the dark, alone, but finally, irreversibly, free.